I hadn't spoken to the land in years, not the way my grandfather taught me to. Somewhere between his funeral and the slow grind of ordinary life, I'd forgotten how to listen. The wilderness that once felt like home had become just scenery through a windshield, something I passed through but never entered. So when I loaded my truck that October morning and drove toward the remote spine of the Colorado backcountry, I wasn't sure what I was hunting for anymore. The old logging road narrowed to nothing, forcing me to continue on foot with my pack cutting into shoulders that had grown soft with city living. I told myself I needed solitude, maybe a clean shot at an elk to fill the freezer. But that wasn't the truth, not really. Something deeper was pulling me forward, a quiet desperation I couldn't name, like my soul was trying to remember a language it had forgotten how to speak. The valley I found felt untouched by time, wrapped in the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Pine trees stood like sentinels around a clearing where I pitched my tent as the light began to fail. The air tasted different here, older somehow, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder at shadows that hadn't moved. That first night, I lay awake, listening to my own breathing, wondering why I felt like I was being measured by something I couldn't see. Morning came too slow and too bright, the sun cutting through the pines like it was exposing something that preferred darkness. I forced down cold coffee and studied the clearing with fresh eyes, trying to shake the unease that had followed me through the night. That's when I saw them. Deep gouges carved into the bark of an aspen 20 yards from my tent, running vertical like something had dragged claws down deliberately, marking territory or sending a warning I didn't know how to read. The scratches were too high for a bear, too purposeful, and beneath the tree the ground was disturbed in a way that suggested weight and intention. I knelt and found a scent hanging in the morning air, musky and sharp, organic but wrong. Somehow like wet fur mixed with something older than rot. My grandfather's voice surfaced from memory, telling me that some smells are designed by nature to trigger fear, to make prey understand when they've crossed into another world. I checked my rifle twice, though my hands were steady and my mind clear in that dangerous way men get when they're trying to convince themselves they're not afraid. The forest felt different now, watchful and patient, as if it had been waiting for me to notice what had always been here. Every snapped twig and shifting shadow became a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered, but I didn't leave, and that decision would change everything I thought I understood about what walks unseen through these ancient places. I found the elk 2 hours into tracking, though calling it a find feels too clean for what I stumbled into. The massive bull lay in a narrow ravine where the pines grew so thick the sun barely reached, its body positioned with a precision that made my stomach turn. The ribcage had been opened carefully, almost surgically, and the choicest organs were gone, while the rest remained untouched, arranged like an offering or a message written in flesh and bone. What stopped me cold wasn't the kill itself, but the branches woven around it in a loose circle, each one planted upright in the soft earth like boundary markers. No scavenger works with that kind of intention, and no predator I knew bothered with ritual. I circled the scene twice, my breath shallow, noticing how the ground showed only partial prints, deep impressions that suggested something walking upright but choosing carefully where to step. The forest had gone completely silent, that unnatural quiet that happens when every living thing decides to hold its breath and wait. I felt eyes on me then, not imagined but certain, the weight of observation pressing against my back like a physical hand. My grandfather once told me that some creatures don't just hunt. They study, they remember, they decide whether you're worth acknowledging or removing. Backed away slowly without turning around, my rifle held loose but ready, understanding with absolute clarity that I was no longer the one doing the tracking. Something had allowed me to find this place, had left this evidence like a door cracked open, and I'd just accepted an invitation I didn't know how to refuse. I didn't sleep that night, just lay rigid in my sleeping bag, listening as the footsteps began their slow circuit around my tent. Each step landed with a weight that seemed to compress the earth itself, deliberate and patient, measuring the distance between us with methodical precision. The breathing came in low, rhythmic waves that I felt in my chest more than heard, a sound, too, controlled to be mindless, each exhale carrying what seemed almost like consideration. I understood then that I wasn't being hunted. I was being evaluated, studied with the same careful attention I'd given to tracking prints and reading sign my whole life. The circling stopped near the tent's entrance, and in the suffocating silence that followed, I heard something else, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground beneath me. It reminded me of my grandfather's voice when he used to sing the old songs, sounds meant to carry meaning beyond words, communication that bypassed language entirely. My fear didn't disappear, but it shifted into something stranger, a recognition that whatever stood outside, understood boundaries, was choosing restraint, was perhaps even offering a kind of respect I hadn't earned, but was being granted anyway. When dawn finally broke, and the presence withdrew without aggression, I found myself grieving its absence, rather than celebrating survival. The massive prints leading away felt less like evidence, and more like a path being offered. Something had circled me in darkness and chosen connection over violence, and I knew with absolute certainty that following meant crossing a threshold I could never return from. The prints led me away from everything rational, each depression in the mud deeper than my boot was long, the stride length impossible for anything that should exist. I moved through morning light that felt thin and unconvincing, as though the forest had shifted into a different version of itself overnight. My grandfather's voice echoed in memory. Some paths choose the walker, not the other way around, words I dismissed as poetry until now. With each step, I felt my old life growing distant, the man I'd been yesterday becoming someone I could barely remember. The ravine descended into shadow so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself, the air growing colder with a mineral taste that coated my tongue. I realized I'd stopped checking my GPS miles back, stopped marking my trail, stopped doing any of the things that kept men alive in wild places. The prints remained clear even on stone, as if the creature's weight existed on a different plane than ordinary matter. I was being led, and the certainty of it filled me with equal parts terror and strange gratitude. My hands shook as I gripped my rifle, though I understood with growing clarity that the weapon had become meaningless, a prop from a world that no longer applied here. The forest pressed close, watching, waiting for me to prove myself worthy of what lay ahead. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but a deeper knowing, something older than fear, pulled me forward into the descending dark. The clearing opened before me like a revelation, and I stumbled to my knees at its edge, breath catching in my chest. Stones rose in careful spirals, some as tall as a man, others forming concentric circles that pulled the eye toward a central point where the earth itself seemed darker, older. Animal skulls crowned the tallest pillars, elk, bear, mountain lion, their empty sockets facing outward like silent sentinels. This was no random collection, but a cathedral built by hands that understood something my civilization had forgotten. I moved between the monuments on legs that barely held me, running trembling fingers over symbols carved into stone with primitive tools. The pattern spoke of seasons and migrations, of respect and sacrifice, of a contract between the wild and those who walked within it. My grandfather had tried to teach me this language through stories I'd ignored, and now it surrounded me in 3 dimensions, undeniable and ancient. Tears blurred my vision as understanding crashed through my modern skepticism like water through a broken dam. The bones weren't trophies, but offerings, each placed with ceremonial precision that spoke of gratitude rather than dominance. I thought of every animal I'd killed without proper thanks, every piece of land I'd walked across without acknowledgement, every sacred thing I'd reduced to commodity and conquest. This place was a rebuke to everything I'd become, and the shame of it drove me to my knees again among the standing stones. Time felt circular here, collapsed into itself, and I sensed I wasn't the first human to kneel in this exact spot, feeling exactly this weight of recognition and regret. The air changed first, a pressure that made my ears pop and my skin prickle with ancient warning. I looked up from the stones, and there it stood at the clearing's far edge, so massive and impossible that my mind struggled to accept what my eyes reported. 8 feet of corded muscle beneath dark hair that seemed to absorb light itself, arms that could snap trees hanging loose at its sides. But it was the eyes that destroyed me, deep and golden and filled with something that looked terrifyingly like recognition. We held that gaze across 20 feet of sacred ground, and I felt my heart hammering against ribs that suddenly seemed fragile as kindling. Every instinct screamed to run, but a deeper knowledge kept me frozen, understanding that this moment had been building since I first entered the valley. The creature tilted its head with disturbing human curiosity, studying me the way I'd studied countless animals through my rifle scope. Now I was the specimen, the mystery, the thing being evaluated for worthiness. Its chest rose and fell with breath that moved the air between us, and I realized it was afraid too, not of me, but of what this encounter meant. We were 2 relics meeting in a forgotten place, both carrying the weight of worlds that no longer wanted us. The stones around us felt like witnesses to a trial neither of us had agreed to, their shadows lengthening as judgment waited. Then something passed between us that transcended language or species, a downloading of grief so profound it buckled my knees and forced sound from my throat. The grief hit me like a physical wave, visions that weren't mine flooding through my consciousness with devastating clarity. I saw forests burning, ancient pathways disappearing beneath concrete and steel, generations of its kind dwindling into shadow and legend. The creature wasn't showing me these things through words or images, but through pure feeling. A transmission of loss so complete it made my own pain feel insignificant. I gasped and tears streamed down my face without permission, my body responding to sorrow that predated my entire bloodline. This being had watched the world forget it was real, had survived by becoming a ghost in its own home. Through the connection, I felt its impossible loneliness, decades of wandering without others of its kind, of hiding from the species that had claimed dominion over everything. It had witnessed the land my grandfather loved being carved into pieces, had seen the sacred places reduced to camping spots and trail markers. The weight of that solitude pressed against my chest until I couldn't breathe, understanding finally what true isolation meant. Not just being alone, but being the last memory of something the world decided couldn't exist. Then came something unexpected beneath the grief, a fierce determination to endure, to witness, to survive against a world that wanted only its absence. The creature had chosen to keep living, even when extinction whispered easy promises, had maintained its rituals and sacred spaces despite absolute isolation. I felt the strength required for that choice and recognized it as something beyond animal instinct or human will. This was conscious defiance against erasure, dignity preserved. Through centuries of denial, the connection released suddenly, and I collapsed forward onto my hands, sobbing with the kind of totality I hadn't allowed myself since childhood. When I finally looked up through blurred vision, the creature was still watching me with those impossibly knowing eyes, but something had shifted in its posture, the rigid. Tension had softened into what I could only describe as recognition. It took one deliberate step backward, then another, never breaking our gaze, and I understood this was goodbye. Not a retreat born of fear, but a conscious choice to release me back to my world while it returned to its eternal vigil in the shadows. It raised one massive hand in a gesture so achingly human, it shattered something inside me, a slow, purposeful acknowledgement that transcended species and time. In that moment, I saw not a monster from campfire stories, but a guardian of forgotten ways, a living bridge to everything my grandfather had tried to teach me about respect and balance. The creature nodded once, a movement, filled with such dignity and sorrow that fresh tears spilled down my cheeks, and I found myself nodding back with trembling reverence. Then it simply turned and walked into the dense forest, moving with impossible silence for something so enormous. I watched its dark form dissolve between the trees like smoke, there one moment and gone the next, leaving only swaying branches and dappled sunlight. The forest seemed to exhale around me, the oppressive weight lifting as ordinary bird calls gradually returned, nature resuming its normal rhythms as if nothing world-changing had just occurred. I remained kneeling in that clearing until the sun climbed overhead, afraid that moving would somehow diminish what had happened. My hands still shook and my heart felt cracked open in ways I couldn't explain. But beneath the trembling was something new, a sense of purpose I'd been searching for without knowing it. The drive back to town took 6 hours, but I couldn't tell you a single thing I saw along those mountain roads. My hands gripped the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly become fluid and uncertain. When I finally reached the gas station on the highway, the fluorescent lights and electronic beeps felt like violence against my senses. I filled the tank in silence, avoiding the attendant's eyes, knowing that nothing in my face or words could possibly bridge the distance between where I'd been and where everyone else lived. I tried exactly once to tell someone what happened. My oldest friend, a man I'd known since childhood, listened politely over beers at our usual bar before suggesting maybe I'd been alone too long in the wilderness. The pity in his eyes was worse than disbelief, so I smiled and agreed, letting him think exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. After that, I learned to carry it differently, not as a story to share, but as a fundamental shift in how I moved through the world, a secret architecture beneath everything I did. The hunter I was before that valley is gone, replaced by something I'm still learning to recognize. I sold most of my rifles within a month, keeping only my grandfather's old 30-30 that I never load anymore. Now, I volunteer with conservation groups, spend weekends removing trash from forgotten trails, speak at schools about respecting wild places with an intensity that probably seems strange. I'm protecting something I can never name, honoring an agreement made in silence with eyes that understood everything. Some nights I still wake gasping, but not from nightmares. I wake from dreams of standing in that clearing again, feeling that profound connection to something ancient and enduring. The creature gave me what I'd driven into those mountains seeking without knowing, not escape from my life, but a reason to return to it transformed. I carry the weight of that gift every single day, a chosen burden that makes me more whole than I've ever been, forever marked by what the world insists cannot exist. What would you do if you came face to face with something that changed everything you believed about reality? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the unknown.